perhaps heard trees been called the lungs of the earth. Well, wetlands are very much the sponges or the bladder or the liver of the earth because they do purify the water. So that is something that's very important. Elvars, again, just briefly, very unusual. They are very common in sort of North Bruce in Manitoulin, and they're very much a rocky type of feature. And because of the rock, the vegetation that grows on it is very unusual and very fragile. So for that reason, Elvars, they can't tolerate much disturbance, and they are the preferred habitat for many different types of species, including our one and only poisonous rattler in Ontario, the Massasauga rattlers. And I mentioned dune ecosystems. The dune features, perhaps in other areas along the lake, are a little bit more developed. Sauble Beach, for example, Southampton, a little larger in fact, but certainly you have dunes as well, and because of the area, the location where Oliphant is located in, you have the ability to attract sand and to manage it as well. And again, shore protection, you'll see that word a few times in this presentation. A lot of people don't realize that if the water level comes back up, having those dunes there is much more valuable and much more sustainable than putting in a steel wall or keeping baskets or all this sort of the engineering approach. This is very much the most effective, and it's basically Mother Nature providing us with that protection. It's more a question of how close we build our buildings and our physical features to that, and that's again what comes into some discussions about management. So coastal management. What are we talking about when we talk about the Oliphant area? Well, we have to define the coast somehow. Roughly speaking, I've got here focuses west of the shore road, whatever it is called as we move along. I think it's more or less the same name as we go along, but more or less that area. And I keep saying more or less because we won't know until we get into the details how fragile some of the features may be just on the inland side of that road, and we may make a decision that we may want to change that boundary. But generally speaking, it's west of the shore road. The ABC approach that I've mentioned a few times now, I'll give you a little bit of background on that. A stands for abiotic, B stands for biotic, and C stands for cultural. And if you want the layman's term, the terms that are a little easier to understand, biotic is anything alive, so plants and animals. Abiotic is anything that's not alive, so that's the geology that you talked about, and that's the processes of how the waves roll into shore. And the last but not least is bringing in the human aspect, the cultural. What do we do in Oliphant right now? What have we done in the past? What are we hoping to do in the future with regards to our interaction with that coast? And those are the types of things that we need to talk about in this management approach. But we don't get into that discussion wholeheartedly until we understand the abiotic and the biotic. And the reason I say that is, for example, and I'm going to pick on parking just because I've heard parking a few times in the discussions we've had about Oliphant. You don't want to make a decision as to where parking should or should not be until you know whether you've got some very unique species, whether you've got some very unique vegetation, whether it happens to be an area that's very important from a geologic standpoint or a coastal process standpoint, and then start thinking about the options with regards to something as site-specific as parking or access or boardwalks, that kind of thing. So it very much flows from A, B to C before we get into those level of detailed discussions. So I just wanted to give you that background. As I say, if you're interested in the ABC approach, where it came from, there's a little bit more detail in the research paper that was written by Jeff, and it was University of Waterloo was the group that coined the term. It's been used extensively along the shoreline. I've used it myself professionally in some other projects dealing with management, water management, so it is an approach that's been used quite a bit. And last but not least, coastal management is an approach that's based in science. It is based in, we know what these different areas are important for from a scientific standpoint. Once we understand that, then we can predict what types of influences it may have with regards to different water levels, different temperatures, and all those types of things. And as any plan or as any guide, you're looking at the future. Why are we doing this? We're doing it because it's important to us as a community, but also to our children and our grandchildren. So it's a future-looking aspect. The other thing I'll mention, coastal management, shoreline management, I use the terms interchangeably. Anything along a water's edge. So if you're familiar with conservation authorities, they do shoreline management along their river systems. And again, it's very similar. They're talking about that sensitive area along rivers. And that's the focus of some of those works. Coastal management, just because we're dealing with the Great Lakes, we're dealing with Lake Huron, we tend to use the term coastal. So you may see that they may hear those terms back and forth a little bit. So, securing a positive future, I think I've already mentioned a bit of this. It's a balance. Really, we're looking at the ecosystem, we're looking at what are the building blocks from an environmental standpoint, and how do we as humans interact with that. And we've been involved at a few different areas along the shoreline in the Lake Huron area, and those just are a few that are mentioned. And I do have just a couple of examples which I thought I'd give you. Planning and guiding, I've referred to both terms. Planning is a little more, if you're looking at more, not prescriptive, but a little more detailed, then usually you're talking about a plan. If you're talking about a guide, then it's usually sort of a menu of options. Here's some stewardship things that you should think about if you're wanting to protect and conserve this area. And I'm guessing at this point in time that what we're talking about for Oliphant will be a little bit of a mixture of both, a hybrid of both. Education is extremely important. Because we deal a lot with other communities along the shoreline. I mean, we come to this area year after year, we live here, we take it for granted to some degree. And I know that from personal experience in other areas. We don't necessarily step back and look at it from a different perspective. And I think that's where the education is really important. I know I only get around to the tourism sites in my area when relatives come to visit. I don't know if you're like that or not, but you never go to the place outside your back door until you're showing it off to somebody else. I think we're a little bit that way with our own coastal ecosystem as well. That education is so important because it really beefs up our own knowledge about how special the area is that we do live in. And it also helps to secure funding. I'll also mention that. It's wonderful to have plenty of flubber that have nested in the area, not only because of the environmental significance, but because that's a pretty high priority when it comes to provincial and federal funds. So that's the other thing that's really nice to have. 3 examples. This is Southampton, Chantry Dunes. We did work down there starting in the late 90s. And that was because basically there was a group of cottagers and landowners who saw this happening on the beach. And they really questioned the logic from the standpoint of environmental protection of having, in this case, the municipality actually taking sand and going and using it as fill somewhere else. And they put up their hand and said, no, this is an important area for us. We don't want you mining that sand, and we want that to be something that is looked at from another perspective. And that's when they brought in a management plan and used expertise at the Coastal Center to actually put that together. It was, first of all, on the Beach Association. Those are volunteers. They got the attention of the Beach Committee, which was a committee of council. And basically, through that work, grassroots work of the community group, a plan was created, and that plan was basically what started the ball rolling with regards to managing, in this case, the dunes at the Southampton area. And when we say first in Ontario, they've been doing that in provincial parks for a long time, but this is the first time outside of a provincial park that there was actually a group of people that were interested in managing it from the standpoint of an environmental resource that was important to the community. So that's Chantry. Second one is Sauble Beach, which probably people here have heard of. Friends of Sauble Beach were an existing group. They already were there. They were already involved in beach cleanups and that kind of thing. And they witnessed the good things that were happening south in Southampton. So they recognized they had 10 kilometers of beach. And it was this one, I've got one convincing photograph. It was a photograph of the buses pulling up and 40 people getting out of the bus, and regardless of where the bus pulled up, immediately going up and over the dune. They didn't go anywhere looking for a boardwalk or anything like that. So because of the attraction of the area and the number of buses, we had all these little pathways going across the dunes. Somewhere up around 400 of them along a 10-kilometer stretch of beach.